Hi, this is Glenn with Crimson Lotus Tea, and this is Between Two Teapots, our live stream interview show. And we are here. Our guest today is Mark Mohler, Sanguine Teapots. Say hi, Mark.
Hello, how's it going?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. How are you doing today?
Doing well. It's my day off this week, and
Oh, nice.
ready to sit down and talk some teapots.
So is it your Saturday, Sunday, or kind of both? You get one day off?
Yep, my Saturday, and then I have 2 days off. Which is
Oh,
good.
okay. Oh, that's certainly nice. Yeah. Okay. Let me make sure that I've got the able to see the chat here, and you guys let me know if there's any audio issues. So let me know if there's any audio issues, and I can adjust them. Otherwise, we'll kind of keep going with this. Oolong Owl says, "Show us all the teapots." We will be showing many teapots. But the first thing we've got is we're going to be drinking Jingmai LOVE. Jingmai LOVE is one of Mark's favorite teas, and it has been for quite a while, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, I would say that it's probably my favorite pu'er.
Wow. Yeah, you actually brought some of this with to Taiwan. You couldn't go without it. Look at that; it's upside down.
Yeah, so that's the 2016. This is actually just the wrapper. The tea's sitting
Yeah,
here,
and I've got my tea right here. I'm about to brew it up. So one of the really fun things about this particular session is all of our Between Two Teapots, we like to brew the same tea. Kind of creates a little bit of a synergy between the session. But this one here has an even added layer of connection because we are both brewing tea in the same teaware that was both made by Mark with the same clay, fired in the same kiln on the same day. So I will show off mine first, which has been warming up here. So this is actually one of my first side handle pots, and I saw this on his site, and I waited a couple months. I gave other people the opportunity to jump at it, and when it didn't go right away, I was just like, must have been meant to be. So I messaged Mark, and I was just like, Mark, you want to trade for some tea? He's like, sure. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's how we get things done in the biz. Do a little horse trading, which is a lot of fun. So why don't you show us what you'll be brewing with today?
So the one that I'm brewing with right now is from the same kiln. Let's see if I can get the light a little better. Is that better?
I think it was better the other way.
All right.
Yeah, there you go, like that. A little more contrast.
So this is the Lizella clay blend with white clay on top. Just a little like slip detail, and this is a really nice one that it's got a lot of different sort of colors going on from the firing.
That's pretty cool. So even the white drips and all that's from the firing?
The white drips are actually, so it's the 2 different clays that I use are Lizella.
Yeah.
And then Tile 6, which is Georgia kaolin.
Okay.
And the Georgia kaolin I use after I make the pots as sort of a decoration on top of the pot. Okay,
so the main clay base is all Lizella, or the main clay base is a mix?
It's a mix, yeah. Okay. So I don't know if I should get technical yet, but basically,
go for it.
Lizella is a really great wild clay from Georgia, single source. They dig it out of a creek bed. I actually went and visited the guy who produces it a couple months ago. And it's a really awesome production. It's a family business where they've just been, digging this clay out for potters for years and years. And it's a great clay, but with any other clay, it has limitations. If you fire it too hot in a reducing atmosphere, so in like a wood or a gas kiln, then it has some kind of funny things that it can do. So I needed to mix it with something else so that I could fire it as hot as I wanted to in the wood kiln.
Gotcha.
And that meant mixing it with another Georgia clay, kaolin, Lizella, or Tile 6 kaolin. And I got the ratio kind of right so that it fires up to the temperature that I want, but it still has the really wonderful color and texture.
That take a lot of experimentation?
No, actually. I took a big risk there. I sort of intuited what the right blend would be and mixed it up. And I only had like a month to make work before the firing. So I just went with it.
So I've also got other teaware from Mark here. So one of the other things that I got was a this cup here. So I'll be drinking from this cup. This cup is also the same clay blend. It's also wood fired. And then for my fairness cup, brewing using this guy here. Mark might remember this. Mark had made these for us when he was in Taiwan. And so you studied in Taiwan with the old masters for a couple years, year and a half, something like that.
Yep, year and a half.
Nice. That's pretty cool. Did you pick up much Chinese?
No.
Just,
Honestly, like I can speak some
Yeah.
Mandarin. Like I can order food for myself. I can get around decently well. I can talk about, teapots and clay. But other than that, not really. Just because I was pretty single-mindedly focused on work, so I knew the words that I needed to know for working in the studio.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I mean, I was honestly just working all the time.
Yeah.
So if I wasn't working for my teacher, then I was working on my own work, and I didn't get out much. So
That's pretty much me in China as well. Like I can chat people up in tea markets talking about teas and things. But then everything else is just a big blur. So cool. So we've got a big, huge array of teaware. Tell us how you got into just ceramics and pottery in general.
how I got into ceramics in general is actually because my grandparents had their house fully furnished with handmade pottery.
Wow.
Made by a guy named W.J. Gordy, who's not like a world famous potter, but in the South he's a pretty famous dude, and he was just a really great American craft potter. And my Nana has this great story she tells about him, which I won't tell here, but basically like he was a really funny, charismatic dude. And so he made a whole set of dinnerware for them. And that's what my dad grew up eating out of.
Wow.
And that's what I grew up eating out of when I was at their house. So I really was connected to pottery in kind of a fundamental way from a really young age. And then I got to try it out in high school, and I'll just be cheesy about it. Basically, I sat down at the wheel and I tried it, and then I never got back up because that was just it. I knew that was what I wanted to do.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the first things that you and I connected on. I think you maybe messaged me when you were moving to Seattle or something like that, and you'd seen our stuff and seen the teaware and things. I also have a history in ceramics. I mean, you know that, but a lot of the customers might not. I also did a lot of work in ceramics in high school, and then community college, and then at the university I was kind of minoring in fine arts / ceramics. I never actually finished up college, so I never got anything titled or official, but I have spent a lot of time in the pottery studios, and spent some time firing stuff myself. Did mostly coil and slab built type stuff. Didn't really get a lot of wheel exposure. So what made you interested in the Chinese style gongfu teaware? Because I'm assuming in high school you weren't making tiny teapots.
No, and honestly, you're a big part of the story. So
Yay.
I spent a lot of time basically honing my fundamentals. I had more of an Eastern mindset when it came to learning how to make pottery, and that I really wanted to hone my craft before I tried to do anything like creative or artistic.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of what they try to push in college and in school. They want you to explore. And I wasn't really interested in that. I really just wanted to hone my craft and,
Right.
get better at what I did before I tried to do things that were unique or, interesting. And so I spent the first 10 years making pottery, making bowls and mugs and cups and plates. And I didn't want to make teapots yet. Yeah. Because teapots are kind of the functional pinnacle for making ceramic.
There's a lot.
It takes every single fundamental skill that you learn as a potter, and it combines them, and then it adds a million layers of subtlety. Each little thing that you do on a teapot is something that has to be well considered for functionality, because every little thing you do differently is going to affect the tea and the way that it brews and the way that it feels and holds. And there's just a million considerations.
Yeah.
And so I waited for a long time before I started making teaware. And when I got to Seattle, I started making teaware at Pottery Northwest.
Right.
And that was a really great sort of home for me. There was a really wonderful, inviting studio, a lot of really cool, encouraging people. And I started making teapots, and I wanted to know, you know, I knew how ceramic people and clay people treated teapots, and it was not really functional, right? They wanted big, sort of British fair style teapots, and it didn't matter if they functioned at all, really. Yeah. Like it could be super heavy or really imbalanced, and that didn't matter to them because it was art.
Right. Yeah. This is it's funny. I mean, the rest of you guys are hearing this for the first time, but Mark and I have had this conversation between ourselves so many times. So for us, it's kind of rehashing some stuff. But yeah, no, this is something that I noticed as well. So you know, when you and I met, it was I was actively trying to find potters that could do stuff the way that they do things in China, and my problem was I couldn't find people who had any inkling in the West of wanting to make things that were functional. They wanted to make things that were pretty. So you did you message me on Instagram first, or did you come by Phoenix or something?
That's exactly how it happened. Yeah. I messaged you guys on Instagram. And I basically just said like, hey, I'd love to talk about tea and teaware. You know, I'm a potter that just became local. And then I met you guys at Phoenix Tea. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think you brought some stuff that you had, and I brought some teapots that I had, and so I just kind of went through all the nuts and bolts of like, well, this is what I like. If I'm, you know, ordering teapots from China, or if I'm working with potters, you know, like this is how I want the handle shaped, and this is how they do this, and this is how they do that and stuff. And I think you and I kind of both just melded minds there for a while, and then your stuff started really taking off, which is really fun to see your progress.
Yeah, and it's funny for me because I was, you know, known as someone who was pretty good at making pottery even before I started my journey with teapots.
Yeah.
And as with any craft, the better you get, the more you learn that you're really not any good. Yeah. And so I got to this point where it was like, okay, I want to make teapots and I want to get more serious about this. And I realized just how far I had to go.
Yeah.
And I had an inkling of that, right? I've been exposed to some really wonderful artists, one in particular from Taiwan named Alian, who makes phenomenal vessels. And I've been exposed to Yixing teapots by this point, but I hadn't really had great examples of it in the US because there really aren't that many people, like you were saying, that are doing it. So it was like slowly easing into learning what is really required from the craft. And I honestly believe that in the last year and a half, my work has gotten, you know, leaps and bounds better than it has in the last 12 or 11 years, just because of, you know, that increased understanding and consideration for, you know, what's necessary.
I would agree with that. For everybody that's got questions in chat, I'll get to them as they kind of come into the conversation that we're having. Yeah, so I think I commissioned like 10 teapots from you or something like that, and you actually made these here in Seattle at Pottery Northwest, right? I actually
Yep.
Wait, no, you made yeah, that's right. You made this one here. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's super cute. I love that. Love the little spout and stuff. And so I was just like, all right, well, tell you what, like I'll commission like 10 of those. And then I actually was digging around and I found one downstairs that I apparently didn't put on the site. And that's this little guy here. And so this is actually the last one. This is an 80 ml pot, and I actually just posted this to the site right this morning. So if anybody really wants the last of the Crimson Touch pots, there is one on our website right now. Yeah, so you started. Yeah, this was like well, you'd made some little gaiwans and cups and things like that, and I think we saw some of the stuff. And you started selling some things in some different shops, like at Phoenix Tea in Seattle, and you know, like the Chinese tea shop or not the Chinese tea shop. What's it called?
New Century Tea.
New Century down in Chinatown, and so that was kind of cool. So you were starting to get kind of like your work out there, and then you got the chance to go to Taiwan, right?
Yeah, that was sort of a crazy sequence of events.
Yeah.
I met the potter Alian when I was in college, and then I lost his email, lost contact with him, and then at New Century, I ended up sitting next to a dude who I'm now actually good friends with. who randomly had met Alian also.
Yeah.
And he had Alian's email. So
Aha.
he gave me Alian's email. And this is like, 6 years after I met him. And so I recontacted him and I was like, hey, I'd love to come to Taiwan to do an apprenticeship, because I felt like if I didn't do it then, when else was I going to be able to?
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember, it was because you'd been telling me about it. And then all of a sudden one day you're like, yeah, I'm moving to Taiwan. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. And then you made it happen like really, really quick. And that's a big step, especially, you didn't really know much about the culture and you didn't know much about the language, but, clearly you knew that as soon as you got into a studio that, you'd be able to speak the language of clay, as it were.
Yeah, and I think that ended up being true more or less. That working in the studio made it so that the language barrier was less of an issue. It was still an issue for sure, but less. But basically, yeah, I emailed Alian, and then before I got a response from him, I just decided that I was going. I bought a plane ticket.
You're like, I'm going to be there. Find some place for me to work.
Yeah, put in notice with my work, and I basically said like, all right, I'm going, and if I have to sweep floors for 3 months or whatever, or teach English if I needed to,
right,
for the first however long, then I'll do that. But
you're gonna work it out.
Yeah,
that's cool. That's kind of what you gotta do, and I think a lot of people wouldn't really be willing to take that risk. There's certain the old adage, fortune favors the bold, certainly kind of works, and it was really great to watch your stuff. Your progress. There's a lot of comments in chat about clay, and clay is obviously super important to pottery. I was fascinated with the idea of teaware that could make the tea better, right? Which is the whole point of like unglazed, like Yixing, or even like Jianshui, which is glaze with an iron-rich glaze and stuff, and then Jianshui clay and other clays. And so I found like every place that we went in China, like they had like these massive like natural reserves of like clay that just did amazing things for tea, and I wanted to find similar stuff in the U.S., right? So I go to is the big pottery studio in Seattle just called Pottery Northwest, like the actual like retail store, right? So I walk into Pottery Northwest, and they've got all these different types of clays, and I was so excited, like they got Snoqualmie clay and Granite Falls clay, and they got all these clays named after all these local areas. And I'm like, oh, that's great, like it's so cool, like I can like get access to like local clays from like the Cascades or the Olympics and stuff. And started asking about it, and they're like, no, those clays aren't from here. And I'm like, well, why is that clay called Gold Bar? I thought it was dug out of like Gold Bar. They're like, no, we just named it Gold Bar. Like, well, where does it come from? They're like, I don't know. And then like the more questions I asked, like the more like really snooty they got with me. And I'm just like, well, I'm just trying to find like locally sourced like clays. Like I want to see, like I work in tea and I work with potters in China, and they're like, oh, you work with potters in China? I'm just like, where's this coming from? I'm like, I'm just trying to learn a little bit more. And they got upset. They're like, you can't use like local clay. And I'm like, I don't care, whatever. I'll just leave. But then once you mentioned like Lizella clay and like Georgia clay, and I'm from Georgia. I wasn't born there, but I lived there for quite a long time. And Georgia's famous for its clay. Georgia clay, Georgia red clay. That's just the state takes great pride in their clay, and so. Being able to find that there were interesting clay reserves that somebody was actually using to make teaware out of, and so I think I missed the chance at some of like your first Lizella stuff, and so like as soon as I saw you were doing more Lizella stuff, I was like, dude, I gotta get something, and so that's where this came from. So just tell me a little bit about how you feel about different types of clays, or your thoughts on how and what it does that actually like makes it unique for tea.
So I think the most important thing to consider when you're talking about clay for teaware is that it's not one clay that is good for teaware. Yeah. It's really how the artist applies their craft to the clay and their understanding and their knowledge of a clay. The reason why Yixing clay is so good for teaware isn't because it's like, oh, you dig it out of the ground and then all of a sudden it's great for teaware, right? There's a huge amount of skill and process and tradition and time in between the ore and the actual product. And all of those things are considerations for making a good teaware, not just the clay, right?
Yeah.
When you take a raw product, you have to figure out every single part of the process to get it from point A to point B. And that means that in Yixing, for instance, they use all hand building techniques.
Yeah.
No wheels, right? They have a little banding wheel that's sort of a hand turned wheel, but they don't use any electric wheels or anything.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that. It's because the clay is not plastic.
Yeah.
It means that if you try to throw it, it just doesn't hold up very well. So it needs to be compressed while it's being made, right? And if you've seen videos, I think most people or a lot of people have seen videos.
There've been a handful of really,
paddles.
really cool ones coming out lately, showing the step-by-step process.
So they use paddles and like bladed wooden tools, and they have really beautiful handmade tools. And I make most of my tools too. I think that's a great practice. But the reason why they make the teapots with those processes is because of the characteristics of the clay. And so when you go to different regions, you find that the same thing is true, that they're making the teapots in the processes that are best tailored to the clay.
Right.
So like in Jianshui, they're using a wheel.
They use a wheel for everything, Jianshui.
Yeah. Because the clay is plastic enough to throw. And so why not, right? Like that's generally speaking an easier process, and it takes less time to learn how to throw also than it does to do the hand building techniques.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the regional differences in Japan, that's really like my shining example of like, there isn't one good clay for whatever purpose.
Yeah.
In Bizen, they have clay that's really, really beautiful, but it's super plastic. It's super like stretchy and easy to form, but it shrinks a lot. So what that means is they can't put glaze on it.
Yeah. Oh,
if they put glaze on it, the glaze will just shiver off. It'll fall off.
Right.
It just doesn't work. They can't get it to fit right. So all of their pottery is wood fired.
Yeah.
Because in the wood kiln, all of the effects are sort of baked in, built onto the surface. Yeah. And then a place like Shigaraki has really bumpy, rough clay.
Yeah.
So the wares that they make are much more sort of geological and geometric and very sort of simple in their design, but very nuanced in the way that they're formed.
I love rough clay.
And then you have somewhere like Tokoname, right? Famous for making teaware. It's another region in Japan. They're making teaware, totally different clay, totally different processes, all thrown. And so it's really, in my opinion, not about the clay so much as it's about the mastery that's applied to the clay.
Right.
And specifically for teaware, the main thing is figure out how to process it correctly so that it's sound, right? So if the clay can be thrown, throw it. If it needs to be compressed, hand build it. You know? So follow the processes that the clay, you know, is tailored best to, and then learn how to fire it to the right temperature in the right conditions. Yeah. So porcelain, for instance, can be fired in oxidation in an electric kiln. Yeah. And you just fire it really, really hot, and then it's vitrified and it's good to go. Safe, ready for teaware, right?
Tell people what vitrified means.
Vitrified is basically the same thing as glassified. Okay. So when you have a clay, it transitions through different like landmarks in the firing process. Yeah. One is when all of the chemical water burns off. So first you have like the water in the clay evaporates, and then there's still water molecularly bonded to the clay. When that burns off, you have a bisque fire. That's like the first firing. And then you get up higher and you get to what's called quartz conversion, where certain molecules in the clay change crystalline structure. Right. And that happens as you go higher and higher. Once you get to a certain point, the clay is plastic in the kiln. So it like could bend if you push on it. It's basically melting. Yeah. And when it gets to that melting point, that's when it sort of becomes stone again. Yeah. If you fire it hotter than that, it'll eventually just turn into a puddle and melt. If you fire it lower than that, then the porosity increases. Yeah, it's actually, it's kind of beautiful sometimes when they melt and get really weird. Yeah. Not functionally, but it can be cool looking. Yeah. If you fire less than the point where the clay vitrifies, then you get something that's more and more porous as you go down until it's less functional. So the key for making good unglazed teaware is finding that sort of sweet spot where the clay is well vitrified, but not pushed to the point of getting defects like bloating or warping or looking funny. And the reason why that's complicated is that with stoneware, right? With porcelain, again, it's mostly about temperature. Yeah. With stonewares, there's always going to be some amount of iron in the clay. Yeah. And that iron is acted on by the kiln when you add fuel. So when you add gas to a kiln, if you add enough gas, at some point there's not enough oxygen in the atmosphere of the kiln, and it just can't combust like there's not enough oxygen. So it starts pulling oxygen out of the clay, actually, in the glaze. And that effect is called reduction.
Okay.
And what that does is it changes, you know, a light colored clay. I don't know if I do have a good example. So it changes what would be a lighter colored clay.
Yeah.
And then if you turn it around, like it's much, much darker.
Yeah.
And so it changes the form of the iron from Fe2O3 to Fe3O4, from red iron to black iron.
So the dark side of the pot is the pot where the oxygen was being pulled out of?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the heavy reduction. And then the lighter side is where there's less oxygen that's been pulled out of the clay and less
Super
reduction.
cool.
Yeah.
Super cool.
And the secondary effect of reduction is that it increases the melting of the clay, because the black iron phase of iron has a stronger melting property than red iron does. And so the more reduction, the more melting. This is key for Lizella because it's actually quite a porous clay, but if you apply enough reduction to it, all of a sudden it goes from being porous to being very beautifully vitrified. And that first batch of Lizella pots that you were talking about, that was sort of the key to me learning, like, oh, this clay is going to be good for teaware, because I fired it in an electric kiln up to cone 6, and it was like a brick, right? Like a home brick, super porous, didn't even look fired. And then I brought it to Seattle.
Yeah.
And I brought this small selection of work to Seattle, and I put it in a reduction atmosphere at the gas kiln. And all of a sudden, magic. Yeah. Right. It went from being this dry, sort of orangey brick red color to this beautiful, deep red, sort of like metallic almost color. And that's when I knew that I had something special, because if I applied enough reduction, the clay became vitreous enough, became non-porous enough to really be functional as teaware.
So Yodes of Teapot and Tea has a question somewhat in line with what we're talking about now. Well, the question is, what kind of clay do you use, Mark? We're kind of on that, but you can expound on that. What kind of clay do you use, Mark, and how much processing does it need as compared to Yixing clay?
So the amount of processing necessary for a clay is really based on how it's extracted from the earth. Lizella, the clay that I use from Georgia, one of the clays I use from Georgia, is extracted wet. So it's just dug out of a creek bed, essentially, and it's already wet. So there's not much processing that needs to be done.
That's really cool.
Yeah, the guy that processes it, he dries it out. He like basically piles it up, lets it dry, and then mills it, crushes it down, and then passes it through a filter to get all the larger particles out, and then mixes it with water. And that's it. And it's ready to go, ready to use.
Yeah, people don't realize how much actually goes in, like the steps from like taking it out of the earth into like where you throw it on your wheel. And the next time we're in Jianshui, I should take some more photographs of like it's a massive industrial process, and even in a small shop. The really small shops are going to go someplace else and get it because they can't really have all the tooling and the machining it takes to actually do that. But you'll go out to like some studio some guy's got up in the mountains outside of Jianshui, and he's just got hundreds and hundreds of metric tons of clay just sitting in piles outside. Yeah. And that's just that's his investment, Every time he's get a chance to buy some more, like they just toss it in the back of like some dump truck, and he just dumps it literally in his yard. And then when they want to like do some batch of something, they like bring in like the little backhoe, they take a couple scoops out of it, they toss it into, like the whatever the names for the different machines are, and they mulch it and strain it and press it and extrude it and squish it and mush it until finally eventually it all comes out of these like big super dirty machines. And then but hey, I mean it's dirt. I mean it's dirt's in the teapot. I mean that's what it is. So and then they finally get something that they can actually work with, and that part of things I think a lot of people don't really understand that. So that's pretty cool that in Lizella that there's not a whole lot of processing going on, because I think in some places there's a bunch more. I mean in a lot of what people just assume as like Yixing clay is any of 100 or more different things from different places in the area and different mines, and some of those mines don't have anything anymore, and then other mines, like they take 3 different mines and kind of mix it together to replicate this old mine and stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes even before like the potter gets their actual hands on it. So
yeah, and there's a fundamental difference between a wet clay that you like can harvest from a creek bed, for instance, and a clay like what they often use in Yixing, because it's in a different stage geologically. Yeah. Right. The clays in Yixing, for the most part, have actually already been compacted back into something similar to stone.
Okay.
So like when you have a clay deposit, if enough pressure is applied to it, it can become shale again.
Gotcha.
It becomes a sedimentary rock, and shale can be oftentimes crushed and made back into clay. Here in Pittsburgh, I've actually found several like shale rocks that if you take them and you sand them a little bit or just like rub on them, it's clay. It's clay shale. And it would be just like an Yixing where I could take the shale and crush it and then process it. But the fundamental difference between a clay that can be wet harvest and a clay that's harvested as a stone, which is what most clay and Yixing is that it first has to be crushed, right? And then water has to be added to it, and it has to be aged.
Yeah.
Because the stone is not going to have enough like stuff in it to be plastic.
Gotcha.
Wet clay has bacteria, it has organic matter, it has all sorts of fungus and weird stuff in it that makes it very plastic and easy to work with, right? But a clay that becomes a stone, you can imagine there's almost nothing in it. Because it's been compressed and pushed down geologically and turned into something inert. So when you crush it and you process it, it has to age for potentially years. Out in the rain is a great way to do it. Most people that have wild clay leave it, they'll dig it up, put it in big vats, and then let it get rained on for a couple of years to help it weather.
Yeah.
And so that the sort of plates of the clay, because clay is basically like little plates that slide against each other. That's why it's plastic.
Okay.
It's like little discs when you look in a microscope. And so you want those discs to re-lubricate, right? And separate from each other so that you have a plastic product. And that's why in Yixing, they have to process the clay for so long. They talk about the generations of aging. That's because they start with a product that's much less workable to begin with.
That's also why they're continuing to make things from mines that have been empty for 30 years because, people still have that. And that stuff has incredible value. Like some guy who's got like 10 metric tons of some specific Yixing ore mine in his backyard. I mean, that is, because that's a lot of value. Jugpan's got a question. He wants to know if you've tried aging clay yourself.
I have. So when you're working with dry materials and you're using more industrial materials to make your clay, which is what I did in college. I made my own clay blends out of different industrially produced clays from around the world, really. And I would make the clay in these big mixers, right, with a cement sort of vessel where it mixes with these metal arms, and you make about 200 pounds at a time. And I would make, 800 pounds or so in a day for classes and then for myself. And I actually would mix tea with the clay or beer in order to introduce some organic life to the clay. And then I would set it aside for as long as I could. Yeah. Right. I was going through clay so quickly at that time that I usually only could let it age for about a month. But the longer you can let it age after you start with a very sterile product, the more plastic and better the clay will be. So when we bag up the clay, if you open it up and you see mold on the clay, that's like really exciting for a potter because you're like, yeah, this clay's ready. Like, it's going to be really nice and funky and plastic. And sometimes, man, my clay was smelly, but the smelly clay works great because that means that it's got a lot of stuff going on and it's really plastic. So yeah, aging clay is really important. If you start with a sterile material, like I was saying, if you start with something that's geologically a rock, it's very sterile. You need to age it. Yeah. If you start with something that's wet out of a creek bed, it already has all sorts of life and organic matter in it. Right. The particles are already small enough and
if it's from a creek bed, I mean, it could be anything. I mean, you're like, branches falling down, like a snail getting stuck, like like a fish dying and decomposing. And as weird as that sounds, I'm like, that's what, for people who aren't familiar with this, that's literally what's making your clays what you want them to be, is all of that stuff getting introduced. And it's, I don't know, for me, I really like the whole circle of life with tea and teaware. I mean, tea is grown in the soil. Tea, like the roots of the tea plant like reach way down deep, and they're sitting there, like pulling in nutrients from the clays and the soils, and then gets pulled up. And so you're tasting the clay, you're tasting the earth as translated by a tree, and then if you're actually like brewing it in that, and then you're sitting there, you take your tea leaves out and you dump them outside, well, like that stuff's like decomposing and just kind of going back into it. And I don't know, for me, I just think I think that's super cool. Sven's got a question. It says I said it might be a hard question to answer since it's so subjective. Wants you to speak a little bit on like specifically how your clays affect the teas that are brewed in them, like specifically like this Lysella, maybe in comparison and contrast to Yixing or something like that.
So I can't really, I won't say what my experience is with my teaware because, I mean, like that, you know, I'm obviously way too biased about my own work because I enjoy it.
Yeah.
Its effect on the tea, honestly, like I've only been working with this clay for so long, right? It's only been a couple of years that I've worked with this clay in a more intense way. So to say that like I know it's going to be good for tea long term, you have to season a pot for a long time. This pot is from the first batch firing, the same as the pot that you have, right?
Yeah.
And this is the pot that I chose for myself. And so I've been brewing tea in this pot, white tea specifically, aged white tea only in this pot since I got it out of the firing.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that this pot brews tea beautifully. I really enjoy it. What its effect is on the tea, I mean, it does a good job. From what I've heard from other people, so from my customers that have bought my teapots, I've been told that they're really great for sheng, and that they tend to round the bitterness of the tea, or you know, round the defects of the tea a little bit. Whether that's because they're stealing a little bit, right? Because it is a little bit porous, and it is going to steal a little bit from you for a little while.
Yeah.
You know, they're probably doing that. When they start to give back, on the other hand, that's the thing that I don't know yet because I haven't gotten enough input long term from people using the clay.
But dude, we need answers. You got to start brewing a lot more tea in those pots.
Well, I can
just keep it going all day.
For myself. Yeah. For myself, I can say, you know, like, and obviously, I'm super biased. I can say that this pot has been giving back to me in big ways because I've been brewing the same tea in it over and over again, and it's dedicated to aged white teas that. I can tell you the same tea in this teapot versus a new teapot is better.
Have you noticed a difference in body?
I would say that you get a thicker, like a better, more oily, thicker mouthfeel because it's taking less away from the tea.
Over time, as it's become more seasoned.
Yeah.
And so like, go ahead.
Well, the effect on the tea is like, it's very important, right? But the thing that I notice more than that, if I'm being totally honest, is the effect on the clay. So I've been brewing this pot for a really long time. And one of the fun things that's happened, you probably won't be able to see this because it's a really subtle detail, but along the edge of the pot, I actually apply alumina hydrate, which is a material that keeps the lid from sticking during the firing.
Right.
And there's a little line there that you can see right when the pot's fired. And then I scrub that line away. Yeah. I clean it off as best as possible so that it's barely visible. But as this pot has absorbed tea oils, that line has come back. And I can see, because that clay was less interacted with by the fire, that it's changed differently by absorbing the tea oils. And the texture and the feel of this pot, completely different from when I started brewing with it. And like when you first start brewing with it, you'll see like there are a little bit of color inconsistencies with the tea oil is absorbing at different rates and sort of changing the color and the feel of it at different rates. As it matures, as it absorbs more tea oils over time, as a long time, right? I'm not pouring tea over the outside of this. It's just going from the inside out very, very slowly.
Yeah, okay.
The texture and the look of this clay is completely different, right? It feels much smoother. It looks much smoother. And that's the thing as a potter that I'm going to notice the most.
So you don't pour tea over your teapots. I like to do that.
I pour hot tea. I mean, sorry, not hot tea, hot water.
Hot water.
So I pour hot water over it, but not tea, because I never use a chahai. I always just go from the teapot straight to my cup in one go. That's just the way that I brew tea.
I like to give mine a little bath.
A big.
You got a fairly big cup. And that's you actually, when you started with the brew bowl things, like your first brew bowls were like these monster things like that. You said that was kind of like a Korean style or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. And honestly, like as much as my work is influenced by Taiwanese ceramics, I think that aesthetically and spiritually, my pots pull more from Korean style ceramics. All the way through college, my biggest mentor was a Korean artist named Sangku. He was my professor. And one of his good friends, Lee Kang-hyo, is a really well-known bunshang guy. He makes ongi pots, like huge fermentation vessels.
Gotcha. Right.
He came and worked at the university for a while, and I made tea for him every morning. We had conversations, and I sort of like got to watch him make work, and that was hugely influential on me as far as my philosophy for ceramics. And in my tea bowls, you can really see that the most, where I use sort of slip decoration. I can't show you right now. Oh yeah, I can. So I decorate the inside with slip.
Nice.
And then the color of the clay is on the outside. I don't know how well that's visible, but
pretty close, pretty good. Yeah, okay, I can see the brush stroke on the outside there.
Yeah, very reminiscent of a Korean style tea bowl, and they're very light and organic.
Yeah.
And even like the way I form my spouts is more inspired by Korean ceramics. So
yeah, you've got an interesting spout style. So I mean, if you know, I can show for some examples of I think a lot of the Chinese style, they really like it to be like super integrated, you know, like it's very, very, very like, well, I mean, this is an extreme example just because this is Zishan, it really likes it, but I kind of like the way like you've got kind of like a big kind of like bulbous thing. I jokingly call this my like my A-team teapots, because that's the black with like the black with the red. But yeah, no, I really like the how the spout, your style on the spout. And then you've also got you also do something a little bit differently as well. A lot of the Chinese style stuff uses like a single air spout on the top. If you guys don't know, that's super important. If you don't have that on there, like everything, you just can't pour the tea out. It just gets like waterlogged and jammed inside of there. But on most of your pots, you actually kind of work it into like the on a side edge kind of thing, which is kind of fun. I remember there was some criticism, Chinese gongfu purists had that were like, oh well, like you can't actually like stop the stream as you're pouring it. Like as somebody who's been making tea for 7 years now, like I literally never do that myself, right? I mean, I use it as an example to see if the pot's good, but like I've never actually ever brewed tea that way. So so it's kind of nice to kind of see that.
For me, it's a functional balance, right?
Yeah.
Having the hole in the top is traditional.
Yeah.
And like you can try to control the flow with that. But the reality for me is that if you have to put your finger on the corner of the lid, that's much less secure than if you can just slam it on the top and be good.
Yeah. I get it. Totally makes sense.
I talk about something I call lid anxiety, right? When you're pouring the pot, you're afraid the lid might fall off. Yeah. I would rather reduce lid anxiety than have something that's traditional in this specific instance. And the reality is, in Taiwan and in Korea, having the hole in the side of the knob like this is actually very common.
Okay.
It's pretty much only like very traditional Chinese designs that only have the hole in the top. In a lot of places where I went, even like very well-renowned ceramicists they would carve the hole into the side of the knob. And it's for that reason that you have a really nice secure hole in the pot.
Easy to grip onto it. That makes sense. Yeah, Ben, that's what we're talking about right now is the hole in the pot. Basically, it's just you get water lock, you get vapor lock. You know, if you don't have a hole in that and you try to pour something out, you know, it's like tipping over like a 2-liter bottle of water. It goes blub, 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 blub. You know, it just takes forever for it to get out. But if there's a hole in the top of it, you know, like dumps out really fast. And so you actually really want, when you're brewing tea, you want a vessel that can just get the tea out as fast as possible, you know. So if you sit there, you know, you counted, you know, like you're 10, 12, 15 seconds, you know, you're ready to pour your tea out, boom, you dump it out. And like you don't want it to wait like another 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds for the tea to get out. So you want a fast pour, like you want it to get out as fast as possible. And so that's actually one thing that if you guys have any teaware that doesn't pour fast and you've got like you take a look at this. If that hole is too small, get like some little tiny drills or little tiny files from like Home Depot or something and just like work them through there. You know, when we put in a teapot order with a Jianshui or something like that, we're buying 2, 3, 4, 500 at a time. There will always be 1 or 2 that just don't pour good. And I actually test every one. I test every one by hand. So if I find one that doesn't, sure enough, I go and I look in there and there's maybe like a little bit of like kiln dust or a little something in there. You can kind of like work it out. And you can take a pot that has a really slow pour and you can turn it into something that'll pour really quickly. And so I'm a DIY type of guy. You know, I'm not gonna, you know, go and complain to some potter about some pot or something. I'm just gonna drill the hole out. I'm gonna make it work for myself. So yeah. So Ben, that's the explanation for that. You want to fast pour.
Honestly, that's something that I would encourage people to do. If you don't love one particular thing about a teapot and you think that you could easily change that, and it's a small change, I wouldn't be afraid to do that. I do work after the firing. I do a lot, right? So
Yep.
I'm sanding these pots with 600 grit sandpaper.
Yep.
And like 300 and then 600. So I'm like sanding each pot very carefully on the outside.
Yeah.
I'm grinding the lids into place so that they start too big and then you make them just right.
Yeah.
And oftentimes if the bottoms are a little uneven, I'm going in and I'm sanding that flat too.
Yeah, you can see
So
that.
I
I
really
mean, this
encourage
one
people-
here actually was you know, you can see like the sanding marks and stuff on that.
Yeah.
Yodza Teapot and Tea says, was curious about the differences between wood, gas, and electric firing. If you protect the teapot from ash and make sure it's not reduction fired is the question.
Okay, so when you're talking about different processes, it's really a matter of what you want out of the process. So wood firing, often what we want, at least in the West, a lot of times in the East also, but more in the West now, in the modern sort of ceramic environment, what you want is the random effects, right? The things that are uncontrollable, the way the ash lands, or
Yep.
little drips of things. And that's often also something that's covered in the East, but back in the day, wood was the only option, right?
Right.
Gas and electric are more modern options that weren't available back in the day, but they wanted clean surfaces. They wanted beautiful jade-like surfaces. And that was the inspiration for Celadon, right? The beautiful blue and green glazes that looked like jade. And that's why it was coveted. And so they would put things in what's called a sauger. Yeah.
Some Celadon for people.
Thank you. And so they would put work in these big ceramic jars, lidded jars with no holes in them to keep them from interacting with the fire.
Right.
And they would only get heat, right?
Right.
For
So this
Celadon,
is
you need
in like a
reduction.
big giant like wood fire kiln, like a dragon kiln. Where
Yeah.
you put your teapot in there. You put like a little jar over the top of it, so it doesn't get the interaction. It just gets the heat, and then there is no wood ash glaze interaction at that point, right?
Yeah, because they didn't want any imperfections, right? Any imperfections on the surface would be seen as flaws. And so they would put them in saugers to protect them. If you still want reduction, if you still want the clay to get oxygen pulled out of it for that darker color or for the blue in Celadon, they would make the saugers so they can't get ash on them, but they would poke holes in them.
Oh, okay. All right.
So the pot is still exposed to the atmosphere in the kiln, but it's not exposed to the ash. The other way to do it is to have it in a sauger, but fire for like 5 days or a week, right? And then it's going to get reduction no matter what, just because you're firing for so long and it's extracting oxygen out so consistently. But those are the main two ways that they change the environment in the kiln. The effect that we get now out of an electric kiln is akin to firing in a sauger.
Gotcha.
You're preventing interaction from the outside of the kiln. And now it seems silly, like, right? Why would you fire in a sauger in a wood kiln when you
want that effect?
Get all of these wonderful effects.
Yeah.
But I've actually gone in the opposite direction a couple times where I took a sauger in my electric kiln, filled it up with charcoal, and then put a pot inside and buried the pot in charcoal and fired it that way. And it actually causes local reduction. So I get a cool blackened clay effect in an electric kiln.
Oh, and then there's also that would be similar to soda firing as well, right? I mean, because that's done in an electric kiln, right? Electric or gas or
soda is gas.
Okay, so soda is gas, and so like actual baking soda is actually dumped in during a certain stage. Actually, this is another one that I've got from you. So this was actually this was soda fired, right? So which is pretty cool. So all those effects kind of can do something interesting and similar to the way randomness is introduced to it. And yeah, I love that. Like what do I have any good examples? I love when glazes get drippy, and I love random stuff. And here's some examples of some wood fired stuff that I got. Just like, I don't know, anything like that. Just like I don't know. People in the West love it, but I think in the past, you're right. That stuff wasn't always admirable. They wanted things to look like like perfect and pure and jade like you mentioned.
So it's all a philosophical sort of aesthetic thing.
Sure.
You can get different results out of different firings, but it's really all what you're looking for as your end goal.
Yeah.
So like this is salt. It's a slightly more refined surface than soda. Soda's sort of heavier and more directional, whereas salt sort of is better dissolved in the kiln atmosphere. But when we're talking about soda and salt, quick explanation. You have a gas kiln.
Yes.
Big gas torches burning inside the kiln. And then you get up to the temperature where your work is finishing, and you actually take salt or baking soda. Baking soda you spray in, so you mix it with water and you spray it into the kiln, and then the sodium gets deposited onto the clay. Right?
Gotcha.
In the same way you take salt, rock salt, you put it on an angle iron, you put it into the kiln, and then you dump it over the fire, and the salt immediately vaporizes.
Okay.
And the silica and the sodium, the silica in the clay bonds with the sodium from the salt, and it makes sodium silicate, which is glass.
Gotcha.
Glaze.
Super cool. That's yeah, it's interesting. If you guys don't really know much about ceramics, you're getting like a big, huge like virtual lesson like right now, and I think that's awesome because I think a lot of people don't really know everything that goes into stuff. Sven mentioned back when we were talking about changes in tea, he was curious about, or mentioned it, rounds clay, can you like round it out, remove astringency, maybe increase body. Mentions that it's maybe similar to Juni clay. Is that let's see. I'm not super up on the differences in all of the different types of Yixing clay, and that's primarily because I can't get there. I'm the type of person that I'm very hands-on learner, and I like to talk with people and see people directly as they're making things, which is why I spend as much time as I can in Jianshui, because it's actually in Yunnan, so it's kind of like really close for us. I can go to Jianshui, I can go to Huaning, I can talk to the potters, I can see the clay, I can see how it's made. Yixing is a really long ways away, and so that's why us as a company, we focused on what I can actually like see and do with my hands. So I'm not an Yixing expert in any respect. Kalijay says has a question or two. Are there non-porous clays? Answer would be yes. Or is there a way to make clays non-porous?
Yeah. So I was saying before, if a clay has a lot of iron in it,
yeah,
it's sort of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
That iron makes it so that the clay melts much more efficiently in the hot environment. But the side effect is that if you fire it hot enough in a reducing atmosphere where the gas or the wood is pulling oxygen from the clay, it can cause the clay to bloat.
Yeah.
Right. Which basically means that it sort of bubbles. Where the clay used to be a consistent surface, like beautiful, smooth wall, it'll sort of pop out.
You'll see that on sometimes. I'm trying to see if I've got an example of that. This is an example of a really iron-rich clay that actually went into the kiln flat, and then it just got way too hot and kind of like sank down. So that's what can happen. So what happened to this is it got to like the pre-vitrification stage. What would it be called when it's super plastic like that? What's the name of that stage?
Just plastic. Yeah.
Just plastic. So it got to the plastic stage, and then it just literally just almost just melted and sagged down into this. This was a piece that we got from one of the potters. This is the same iron-rich like clay as like those little teacups. I use this as kind of like a little tea bowl thing until it just randomly just got a nice big fat crack in it. But I'm super excited about this piece. So now it doesn't actually hold water. I just need to fix it up somehow. But yeah, so you were explaining about porous and non-porous when I interrupted.
Yeah, so basically like with porcelain, you don't have any iron. You can fire it as hot as possible. It's never gonna bloat or defect if it's made properly, which is why like Jingzhen is so famous, because they have very, very pure porcelain that's basically just a mix of feldspar, which is a stone, and kaolin, which is the really white pure clay, which we have in the US. Tile 6 from Georgia is a secondary clay deposit. I won't get into that, but basically kaolin is white clay, no iron.
Okay.
You mix that with a little bit of feldspar, which is a stone, and then you have this material that becomes porcelain. And that was sort of like the secret when porcelain was really famous and sought after, a long time ago, when bone china was a thing in France and in England, and they were trying to figure out the recipe. In China, there are deposits where the clay is already commingled with feldspar. So it's just porcelain already.
Yeah.
Kaolin by itself won't really make good clay because it's too brittle and just cracks.
Gotcha.
But when you fire porcelain to the right temperature, it vitrifies, beautiful, totally non-porous, right? With stoneware, if you fire it to a certain point, it gets close to vitrified, but then it'll start to bloat and defect if it goes too hot. So it'll always remain a little bit porous.
So you see some people. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really it, is that because it has impurities, right? They're not really impurities, It's just additions to the clay. Once you get to a certain point, it gets too crazy and there's too much molecular interaction in the clay and it starts to do weird things. So you can only get to a certain point of vitrification. Porcelain is really the only thing that you can get fully non-porous.
So you see a lot of conversation in teaware forums on high fired teaware, low fired teaware. Like you want this for this and that for that. What are your thoughts on what is needed? So high fired is referring specifically to the actual temperature of the kiln, or the temperature that the teaware got to when the kiln was turned off, right? So do you want high fired? Do you want low fired? What are your thoughts on?
So it's a funny thing to talk about, because when you're talking about the temperature of the kiln, that actually matters less than the temperature the clay needs to vitrify.
Right.
So there are clays that vitrify at very low temperatures, and they're totally non-porous, like porcelain style clays that have lots of fluxes in them. They're more glass than clay, really. And so like Lizella, if it's fired with enough reduction, can be almost completely vitrified, like as close as a stoneware can get to vitrified at cone 6, which is about 1220 to 1230 Celsius.
Yeah. So if people might not know what cones are. Cones are pieces of clay that melt at very specific temperatures, and they're usually in the shape of like a little tiny triangle, like very, very small, skinny angled triangle. And then you put it in the kiln, and then you can actually watch in through like a little peephole and wait till it actually like melts. And if you know it melts, then you know it reached that temperature. Do they use those in Taiwan? Because they don't use those in China.
They mostly just use pyrometers in Taiwan.
Okay. In China, they use
digital.
They use a lighter. They'll sit there and they'll pull it out and they'll hold a lighter next to the peephole, because they know the different temperatures on the flame are certain stuff, and they'll sit there and like hold a lighter next to it, and they're like, okay, well the temperature in there is this one now, and they'll turn it off and then close it. I think that's kind of funny how they just kind of eyeball it, literally eyeball it.
That's the best way to do it. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, they just have a natural intuition. I mean, these people are born and raised potters, and so were every single parent generationally before them for hundreds of years. Ruben says we hold our teapots funny. He solved tea lid anxiety by holding the pot in his style, but I don't entirely get it. Catches the handle with number 3 and pinky. Yeah, no, it's really all about just finding what works for you. I guess I generally use most of my pots have like the hole on the top, so I'm actually kind of doing kind of like a two-hand thing is kind of how I do it. I'm actually really liking the side handle style, mostly because I've found like if I'm doing like a lot of like pouring and stuff like this, personally my shoulder has been starting to really bother me, and this is like super ergonomic. I can just kind of just do a hand motion, just do tip, and so I just keep I like it because I can keep a nice big strong like grip right on there. So that's me.
And if you notice the angle of the handle to the spout,
yeah, it's not 90.
Where you place that makes it more or less ergonomic.
Yeah, no, I really like this. I like anyone, I like the people who leave a spot and then put like a branch or something on there. I think that's kind of a fun thing. So I'm actually really enjoying this, and I'm glad that I got that, because that's not is this specifically a Japanese style? Because you don't really see a lot like this in China itself, or I haven't, but you see it a lot coming from a Japanese teaware.
There's also a decent amount of side handles in Korea. That specific shape of the handle is pretty typically Japanese in style, but
Gotcha.
There are a lot of Korean pots that have handles on the side like that. They're just more like a stick instead of a hollow thing.
Right. Actually, yeah, I like the hollow thing. You guys can check that out. Get a fun close up on that in my like big super zoom camera lens there. Will Thurston wants to know what you mean by carbon trap. I think we mentioned that earlier when you were talking about putting carbon into is it a Sager? Is that what you said it was?
Mm-hmm. So carbon trapping is kind of a complicated thing when you're talking about ceramics and the interaction of things. Carbon extracts oxygen from the atmosphere in the firing. Basically, just because when you get it hot enough, right, and you have charcoal in there, as it burns, it expends oxygen to combust that material, and so it'll extract oxygen from the clay. When you say the term carbon trapping in ceramics, though, usually you're talking about something like a Shino glaze.
Okay.
And so you have this Japanese style glaze that's very simple. It's just a stone, a feldspar, and a clay, and that's pretty much it. right? It's a balance of feldspar and clay. And then it makes this sort of milky, beautiful, smooth surface on the outside of the pot. And sometimes it has like weird pitting and crawling, and it looks sort of like porridge. When you reduce a glaze like that and you add really heavy reduction to it, it can turn black in spots. And it's directional and it's very difficult to control. But basically, if it has the right mineral content, it'll absorb some of that carbon and turn the glaze black. So that's what carbon trapping usually means in a ceramic context, is that you have a glaze that's become black because of reduction based on the gas in the kiln.
Gotcha. Okay, there you go, Will. That's the answer to your question. Yield to Teapot and Tea asks, have you encountered efflorescence when making your teapots? How do you prevent it happening without adding barium carbonate?
I'm honestly not sure what you mean by that.
Okay. Yilda,
and then
expound a little bit on that if you want more answers to that question.
I would not add barium to anything on a functional vessel, period, because barium is toxic. If you're talking about leaching, that's another kind of like complicated issue. Generally speaking, if you have stable clays and stable glazes, you never have to worry about it, even if you're using barium in a glaze. But because it's...
Can you define what a stable glaze means?
Stable basically just means that if you put a lemon on it, it doesn't change. It won't change the surface of the glaze. It doesn't interact to any acids.
Gotcha.
Right? So an easy way to do that is to take a glaze, dip it in lemon, and wait. And if it changes at all, it's not stable enough.
The glaze after firing?
Mm-hmm, after firing.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
It's the same thing, like if a glaze crazes a lot and it's not sticking to the clay very securely, right? That would mean that it's not stable because it might pop off the pot.
Gotcha.
So that's, a mechanical stability, but there's also, weathering stability. If you add acid to it and it changes the surface, that's not a safe glaze.
I think that goes into actually goes into Ben's next question, which is kind of nice. This is something that's actually super, super important, but what can people who worry about lead and other heavy metal poisonings do? Resources, advice, info?
Lead is actually pretty straightforward in ceramics. If something is low fired, which means that it sounds and looks like terracotta, if you hit it and it sounds like terracotta, that dum, dum, dum kind of sound, like it's kind of a dead sound, not a ring.
Yeah.
And it's low fired with bright colors. And I'm talking like bright blues, bright yellows, bright oranges. That's not something that I would use for food or human interface surfaces ever.
Yeah.
It's possible it has lead in it. It's not likely, because in most places in the developed world, lead is not even something that you would ever have near your studio.
Yeah.
Right? You wouldn't add it to anything. You wouldn't even have it for experimental purposes. It's just like a hard no. You don't have access to it. In some places, lead was used in the past. I don't know if anywhere even actively uses lead anymore, but that's the marker, is that if it's low fired, it's possible that lead was used, and bright colors, because that's really why lead was used, is that it's a very good melting agent at low temperatures to keep bright colors.
Gotcha.
If something's fired hot, right? If something is high fired stoneware, I'm not saying that lead would ever be used, but even if it were, it's firing so hot, the lead would actually vaporize and it would leave the pot in the atmosphere of the kiln and not even be present anymore in the clay, because it melts at a really low temperature. If you fired it to stoneware temperatures, it would totally atomize out of the clay. It still wouldn't be good. But what I'm saying is, even if a high fired pot had lead, it wouldn't be an issue because it would totally vaporize out of the clay. But again, no one uses lead. It's expensive, it's not efficient, and it's really only good for low temperatures. There's no reason why it should ever be on teaware.
Makes sense. That's a good question. Is that similar for other heavy metal poisonings? Do they all burn off at higher temperatures, or is there anything else to worry about in that respect?
Lead is the only one that's like a really low temperature one that's typically used. The other ones that like are considered not good for functional surfaces. Manganese isn't great. The like bronze looking color glazes that have sort of a crystalline metal surface technically could cause some leaching, but I've read a lot of scientific articles written by ceramic publications about bleaching
Yeah.
in high temperature stable glazes. And the reality is, like, you would have to drink something to the magnitude of 1,000,000 gallons of water out of a vessel that has, let's say, barium in it in a stable glaze to get any sort of meaningful exposure. Lead is so important because a very, very small amount of lead can cause a lot of damage. So if something is brightly colored and terracotta feeling, don't use it for food. Just don't.
Makes sense.
If it's high fired, there's no reason why anyone would ever have used lead in it. It doesn't make sense.
You did mention sound of teaware. That's actually something that's pretty interesting that people might not know about. So what you're saying is sound can be an indicator of the temperature that things were fired at. You can talk about that if you can.
So something that's fired to a lower temperature is typically going to be more porous. If it's more porous, it has a different sound. It'll have a lower pitch ring, right? Whereas if something's fired really high, it'll have a higher pitched or a, you know, that's really nice. Yeah.
Versus, you can keep talking. I'll just randomly hit different teaware around here and see what it sounds like while you're chatting.
And that's something that matters to me, because if something doesn't sound nice when you use it, it's, you know, kind of off-putting. I like things to sound nice when you use them, because if it makes a nasty noise, like
I like some of these ones, like
be really grating. Yeah. So that's
almost,
like a really nicely,
almost rings like a nice little bell. It's a really nice set. Yeah, it's something that I kind of I really like things that sound nice as well. Got a good sound on that one there. Yeah, guys, listen to your teapots.
Dude, listen
to your teaware. Listen to your teacups and stuff like that. Don't hit them too hard together because they might chip or break. But
use like a wooden spoon.
No, this is what, like, Lamo and I, when we're going through teaware stores and stuff, she's like, "What are you doing?" I'm always picking up like pots and like listening to them and stuff like that. Which is pretty cool.
A lot of times when I go to my parents' house, I'll tap on their teaware, and my mom gets mad at me because she knows I'm checking for cracks. If something is cracked, when you tap on it, you'll hear a buzz. It's like zzz, 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 right? Instead of a nice ring, it'll make a weird buzzing sound. And then I'll throw it away because they shouldn't be using cracked pottery. Yeah. My mom's like, "Don't touch that. Don't touch that. It's for display. We don't, like, don't worry. I don't care if it's cracked." But if you're ever worried that something is cracked, if you dropped it, the first thing I'll do if I drop something is flick it. And if it still has a nice clear ring, I'm like, "Oh, okay, it's fine. I didn't mess it up. It's totally fine." But if you hear sort of a buzzing sound, then you know you messed it up.
Adam asks, what makes the perfect teapot in your mind?
Oh man, I am someone that thinks that you should always have the mindset of novice. I think that there's always room to improve and that you're never gonna get perfection ever. Yeah. I think that.
Well, maybe in like even in other stuff, like what is your visual of perfection? You know, because I'm sure you've seen many amazing teawares made by other people.
I've seen some really, really amazing and also really, really expensive teaware. You know, in Taiwan, I got to handle some teapots that would sell for $20,000 US, and like that's actually what they sell for. But
it's amazing.
It's still not a perfect vessel. I think that honestly, the beauty of a teapot and the reason why it's such a coveted form for ceramicists and for potters is that it has this infinite capability for change and different aesthetic variation. And you can see from different cultures, right? Japanese teapots look totally different from Chinese teapots, but they both function really beautifully. Same thing with Korean teapots and Taiwanese teapots. And I would argue that Taiwanese teapots are kind of a mix between a Japanese and a Chinese aesthetic.
Right.
But each culture has a different way. My favorite example is a spout, right? When you look at a teapot, if you look at the spout, it tells you, you know, more or less how that pot's going to behave, and also what its cultural sort of heritage is.
Yeah.
Japanese pots have a certain style of spout. If you look at Japanese work, there's some like pretty typical things that you can see. With Chinese pots, they have a very like flat top spout, right? There's really no forming of it. It's just flat. And that's how they choose to cut the water off. With a lot of Korean ceramics, they have sort of a curl on the bottom of the spout, like what this one has. I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yeah, and this one does just a little bit as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's something that I often apply to my work now, is that little curve.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that a lot. And that was the first thing I noticed, the biggest difference between the last batch of pots that you made for us, because it had a little bit more of a more of
that,
a stout.
That's actually a spout design I still use because it actually works really nicely. This one is actually, so this is the evolution of that idea.
Okay.
Right? It's just a smaller, sort of skinnier iteration of that. So I still use that aesthetic design. It does still have a tiny little bit there that does curve down, but that's still a part of my process, right? This is a more sort of gooseneck.
So you throw the spouts on the wheel as well, right? That's something that people also probably don't realize. Like how many spouts do you throw before you find one that works?
So honestly, I think that's the largest marker of a skilled teapot maker is the spout. And so it's something that I've been mentally and through my work laboring over as long as I've been making teapots. That was the thing that prevented me from making teapots for the longest time because I didn't think I had the skill to do it well. But basically you make a bottle. Yeah. So I'm throwing just basically like a round bottom and then a smaller top, right? And then I'm very slowly pushing in on the bottom and rounding off on the top with water and the clay, pretty slowly doing this, adding pressure to both sides and then shaping it slowly so that I don't crack anything because this is really thin clay. Yeah. And it has to be at just the right amount of dryness, not too wet, not too dry. I noticed the last batch was actually a lot thinner than the than these ones here. So. Oh yeah, and that clay in particular, the Lizella blend, I can get it really, really thin. Oh, that's cool. This clay, it's really nice to work with on the wheel. I can throw it super thin and it's still very structurally sound while I'm working with it, which is not something that all clays can do. So I can make pots that are really lightweight. People may find this a little bit interesting. This is Mark would make tea pets with all of the spouts that didn't quite make the cut, and so I was actually pretty happy to get this one here because it kind of looks like a nice like vesseled heart or something like that. So yeah, that's a bunch of teapots that didn't make it onto a pot, and so I actually have a lot of fun with that little teapot there. Oolong Owl says lefties need more left-handed side handle pots. I always make at least one in every batch. There you go, Oolong. So if I'm making a batch of 10 teapots, there will be at least one left-handed teapot. And I go one step further. Yeah. So all of my teapots have little faces on the lids. You're not going to be able to see that on the I'll give a nice big focus on that. There we go. So, this is something fun. So each pot has a face like that. Each one's unique. And I actually mostly, if you're watching me, I mostly pour my tea with my left hand. I'm, not really very handed. So I use my left hand more than my right when I'm brewing tea. But if you look, the faces are often sort of oriented towards someone who brews tea with their right hand. Right. If you brew tea with your right hand, when you open the pot, the face is pointing toward you. Yep. So I see that. Even for pots that don't look left-handed, right? Side handle pots are obviously left-handed. But for my pots, I'll put the face on the other side for left-handed people. Look at that, man. I always make He's thinking about you, Oolong Owl. So you just gotta buy more of his left-handed stuff. Ruben said it would be interesting to get a compilation of pictures showing different ways people pour their tea. I'll actually make an Instagram post about that. See if people can just post pictures. It's kind of hard because it's kind of hard to have you'd have to have somebody else taking your picture. I find it very hard to try and like hold a camera and do like picture stuff because I'm usually brewing with two hands. I don't think I actually do much one-handed pouring. Now that I'm thinking about it, I like to do two hands for my teapots. Let's see, another question. Sven said, is there a functional reason for the little round hill or bump around the underneath of the spouts at your pots, or is it an aesthetic choice? I don't see it too often on Chinese shapes. Perfect, that's exactly what we were talking about. So it is actually a functional thing. With Chinese pots, the water basically goes straight from the pot out the spout. And the effect that has is that you have to sort of tip the pot a little bit quicker when you start to pour. If you've ever noticed when people pour Chinese-made pots with the sort of stick-like straight cannon-style spout, they tip it pretty quickly to start with, and then the water pours out beautifully. What this does is it slows the water as it comes out of the pot. So it gives the water just a second before it comes out of the spout, sort of slowing the progression so that you don't have to pour as quickly to get a nice pour when you tip it. There we go. It slows the water down. So there's an effect that we use in kilns called the Venturi effect. When something goes from a large volume to a small volume, or a small volume to a large volume, it changes the velocity, right? Because the molecules want to move from the small volume to the bigger volume. And that's how you get kilns to do what they do. The flow is going through the kiln from a small volume to a big volume and then up out the chimney. It's a similar effect in a teapot where you have a large volume of water coming out of a small hole. It wants to come out really fast because there's a lot of pressure coming out of a small space. If you have sort of a collaring where it goes bigger to smaller, it slows the water as it pours out.
Yeah, this would probably be an example of one that just probably shoots out. You could probably get it into the teacup across the table.
And here, I'll be right back. I'm going to grab an example.
Yeah, if you guys have any other questions, go ahead and put them in chat. We'll sit here, and Mark has given us a nice little sample of his time today. So any questions you guys have, he's more than happy to answer them. So get them into chat, and I will ask them as we get to them. Appreciate everybody who tuned in today. This was a lot of fun. I've been wanting to get Mark on a stream for a while, and so it's pretty cool to. He and I used to have tea often. He would come up to our house every other month or so when he was living in the Seattle area, and he and I would sit down and we'd chat about tea, we'd chat about teaware, and it was always a good time. So he and I have kept in touch, and I was pretty excited when he went to Taiwan, got to see a lot of the stuff that he's been doing over there, and I was super excited to get something from his wood-fired Lizella batch. Tai, yes, I love the shui ping shape as well. So I got another, from Yode's a Teapot and tea. In China, they add barium carbonate, usually for unglazed teapots to avoid efflorescence. So I'm wondering, what are the better, less dangerous alternatives? I don't know what efflorescence means in this context, so maybe you could explain that as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Oh,
If you mean bloating, like to prevent the clay from doing funny things, they're basically just fluxing the clay. Barium is a flux, right? It's a melter. It helps to melt the clay and make it more consistent. I would not use barium in the clay that I use because it doesn't need it. Instead, I'm adding different clays to the Lizella just to stabilize it, because I don't need to worry about it bloating when I'm not firing it hotter than it should be fired.
The definition of efflorescence in chemistry, efflorescence is the migration of salt to the surface of a porous material where it forms a coating. So
okay,
yeah, just the attachment.
Honestly, I've never had that problem with my clays because I don't have that kind of mineral content in my clay.
Yode's specified efflorescence is when salts come to the surface of the teapot and it makes it look patchy. So back to his question.
That's a specific thing for different clays, right? If your clay has a really high salt content and it's doing that, then you would need to change something to, prevent that. But
so in you were saying that barium carbonate acts as what's called a flux, and a flux is something that just kind of helps things flow and helps things melt. So if barium carbonate was being added to salt, the attempt would be to make a more smoother pattern over the surface of it, but then you are introducing barium carbonate, which probably isn't what you needed. So in your experience, like if you were doing salt firing, you wouldn't add anything but pure salt. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what they're talking about is salts from the clay expressing out of the clay.
Gotcha.
Which that's not necessarily like NaCl salt. It's probably more like talking about chemistry salts.
Gotcha.
So it could be potassium salts or any sorts of things. But yeah, when you're doing salt firings, you're talking about specifically NaCl, sodium chloride, or sodium bicarbonate, baking soda.
Gotcha.
So these are things that melt and become sodium silicate glass. This is the most extreme example I have of a spout that sort of has like the pooch on it.
Yeah.
And this is made by the Taiwanese master, Alian, who I met in high school, and the guy that sort of set me up with my teacher in Taiwan. And you can see that spout is very suggestive.
just a tad.
It's got a big bulge. And the reason for that is that it slows the flow of the water. This is a tiny spout for this size of teapot. This is like
It is a small, yeah.
15 ml teapot. And the spout is tiny. If you didn't have that, it would just shoot. But this actually pours really beautifully. I'm not going to mess with it right now because I don't have the handle on it. I actually took it out of storage. But he also has this cool sort of ballast on the bottom of the lid that acts as its own lid stand.
That's pretty cool.
It also just helps to keep the lid on the pot.
I like it.
If you want to look up a really awesome ceramic artist to aspire to,
how do you
Ahleon, 2 different words, Ahleon.
All right, I'll type it into chat for everybody.
He's one of the premier teapot makers in Taiwan.
Ahleon.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
And he also does really beautiful sculptural work. He was one of my main inspirations for starting to make teaware because he sort of has this balance of beautiful things that are also functional.
So Ben wants to know, what are your favorite teas, and if you have any love for the Taiwanese oolongs?
I do. I love Taiwanese oolongs. Specifically, I love dongding. Dongding oolongs are just like, it's a funny concept. Me and my friend Michael Busby have talked about a good bit. It's my comfort tea.
Yeah.
Like if I need something that's just gonna like make me feel better and give me, warm fuzzies, dongding.
Dongding's it.
Specifically, traditional dongding is just like the best thing for me. I also really love high mountain oolongs, but that's like champagne for me. Like I don't want champagne every day.
Yeah.
Would I drink a nice dark beer every day? I mean, maybe not every day, but I'm pretty much always down to drink a dark beer. And that's kind of what I feel like dongding is, like this comforting, sort of warming, wonderful tea experience.
Be honest with you. I could drink champagne every day. I could. I love me a good mimosa. I would be more than happy. I would be more than happy to start every morning with a nice big mimosa if I could get away with it. Really
yeah, so I really like Ali-san. Ali-san is great. I also really love GABA oolongs.
Okay.
That's just like something I really enjoy, a little bit like on the problematic side. Like I'm addicted to it. If I have it, I just drink through all of it and then it's gone. And then like other teas that I like, I really love this tea. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. But it's honestly like that's probably my favorite shankor.
A little bit of that Jingmai LOVE. I love Jingmai. I really do. And that was kind of just the inspiration behind it. Like I love Jingmai, so I'm just gonna name the tea called Jingmai LOVE. We had a nice we specifically wanted, when we put this tea together, we wanted to have a definitely a more affordable, budget-friendly Jingmai that specifically, captured kind of like the essence of Jingmai. And so when we put Jingmai LOVE together in 2016, that was the idea. And that stuff actually sold out relatively quickly, mostly because it was so affordable. And then we made a 2018 Jingmai LOVE, and I don't think we've done it since then. Well, we made Honey Bomb. Honey Bomb is kind of the same thing, but I think Honey Bomb has more Huangpian material in it. I think Jingmai LOVE didn't as much. Sven says this is a fantastic stream, learning a lot. Mark is great at explaining. Yes, Mark is great at explaining, and that really helps out a lot. So Mark, we certainly appreciate your chatting about all things ceramics, because there's so much out there. I mean, in China they've been doing this stuff for thousands of years, and when you're in the tea circles, you've talked about it your entire life. But I think a lot of the our Western customers are still kind of coming at this from a new perspective, and so there's like a whole bunch of just knowledge and words and things getting thrown around there, and it can get incredibly confusing. So we appreciate your easy explanations. It helps.
I really took a deep dive on like the technical aspects of clay.
Maybe it's just me. Oh, I can't hear you. I think you're still on the stream. Go ahead, talk again.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Keep talking.
Can you hear me now?
No, it's not you. It's my microphone.
Okay.
My microphone's kind of glitches out a little bit.
I can still hear you pretty well.
There we go. Okay, I just kind of had to. There you go.
Okay.
Can you say something?
Yeah. So basically, I've always been really passionate about the technical aspects of clay and making sure that I know like why things do what they do. I have a book that's kind of like my important tome. It's called Out of the Earth into the Fire.
Cool.
And it's a lady that breaks down the geological origins of clay minerals.
Yeah.
And then why they do what they do in our modern processes. So like when you start with granite, and you weather it over millions of years, it becomes, Montmorillonite clay, for instance. Clays have really cool names. The mineral names of clays are actually really fun, like serpentite, lizardite, Montmorillonite, like all these really crazy ite names. Kaolinite is the clay mineral behind kaolin. But essentially, you start with something that has a wide variety of different minerals from a base stone that's been weathered. And then as it has water filtering through it over eons, right, those minerals are removed and all you have left is white, pure, no imperfection kaolin. And then you sort of have a spectrum all the way in between. But understanding where these materials come from, why they do what they do, and sort of like the chemical reasons and the geological reasons gives me an understanding of why clay does what it does in a different way than just chemistry or just anecdotal sort of knowledge-based evidence. I've sort of tried to learn from every angle that I possibly can to have a better understanding of why it does what it does, not just that it does what it does.
That's good, and it's nice that you've got that, and it's nice that you've got such an easy way of explaining that to people. One of our customers that comes into the live streams a lot, Xiaxio, he's a mineralogist, or he's studying mining sciences in Montana. So anytime I have a question about specific stuff, he's always the one who just like immediately jumps into chat and explains like what's going on, because he just has such a deep understanding of that. And so he's kind of a fun resource for us as well. We touched on it just a little bit, but Ben's curious about the inspiration idea behind the brew bowl. So you can tell us about your brew bowl experience. Do you have any big brew bowls there to show people?
I don't.
Okay,
and that's actually
because they're big, right? I mean, they're like that's
the original one that I used. So it came from a really wonderful tea experience that I had in college. This artist Lee Kong-hyo, the traditional ongi potter, he made this vessel, and it's like this big, right? And it's just a huge bowl with a little spout on the end, similar to that, but way bigger, right? It's like a liter. And I gifted my teacher a brick of pu'er tea, before I really even knew anything about it. And it was pu'er, which at the time I didn't know the difference, right? Yeah. But he literally like cracked off a third of the brick, maybe not, probably like a quarter, but
a
let's
big
just
chunk.
Exaggerate.
Yeah.
He took half the brick, cracked it in half, threw it in the bowl, and then poured it in hot water. And each person got like a cup of tea. And then we kept brewing that tea for like 2 hours while we talked about clay and, the perils of being an artist and how it's a difficult life. And we just sat around this like brew bowl while my teacher sort of like very sloppily brewed tea and talked about how back home in Korea with his artist friends, they would drink tea and pee and drink tea and pee. And that's what they would do, And it was just this really wonderful sort of like heartwarming experience that I had around this very traditional sort of rough vessel, open topped. You could see the tea while it brewed. And I wanted to do something to honor that experience. So I made these smaller versions of this vessel that are, ergonomic. The little ridge on the side is really important so that water doesn't pour at the top. I'm not.
I think I specifically told you to make them even smaller. I'm like, all right, I want 50 of them, but like I want them to be like the smallest ones you've possibly made, because most of our, there's still not a large social tea thing in the West, right? Not a lot of people are sitting down every single day with like 8 of their friends and like all brewing tea together. Like I know there are some examples of that happening. I know some of our customers, like have special sessions and things like that. But I specifically like them because a lot of what we're brewing is matcha, and matcha is just so easy, just to like stuff a whole handful in there. So, but honestly, I end up using it probably a little bit more as a chahai, as a fairness cup, just something to pour the tea into. It's got an interim like cooling stage, and then I pour it onto something else. And they're
that's the cool thing about that vessel, right? If you want to use it to brew tea, you can watch the tea brew. Yeah. So it's a really great thing for someone who's starting to brew tea that wants to watch it happening, and they don't want to necessarily commit to a teapot yet, because teapots do require more thought, more work, more cleaning, all that. That you can literally just like dump out and then rinse it out, and you're good to go. And
speaking of like the amount of like work that goes into it, if you had to guess like from a pile of clay to something that comes out of a wood-fired kiln, how many hours would you put into one pot? Let's say you were building like one pot. I know potters like working, you know, like in scale and stuff like that. But just to give people like a reference about like how many like man hours it takes to make one woman hour, people hours to make a pot.
So when I met you, a teapot took me around 3 hours, and that's an incredible amount of time to put into a single vessel, right? Now, like including what I'm making with the batches, not including firing time, because you really can't add that into it.
Sure.
Because firing usually is like a
these were fired for like
3 day commitment.
These were fired for. I mean, the fire. I mean, the fire was actually going for more than 24 hours, right?
Yeah, it was 2 full days.
Yeah.
So I started firing that kiln at like 8 o'clock at night, and I fired until 5 o'clock in the morning, and then someone else started after me at 7 o'clock, and we fired again until 5 o'clock in the morning. So it was a long firing. But each teapot now takes me about an hour of active time.
Okay, that's pretty good, man. But I mean, you're super efficient at that now. I mean,
yeah, and like for me, that's because anything less than an hour, and I feel like I'm skimping on something, right? I used to take 3 hours. I've gotten down to an hour.
Yeah.
I could make it a lot faster than that, but the issue is that each time I make a teapot, I'm not making it simpler. Every time that I get more efficient at one process, I'm being more considerate also. So if I got faster at making handles, right?
Yeah.
This is a really round, simple profiled handle.
Sure.
And it works great. But if I put in the extra effort to put in this little bump,
you
can see that, right?
Yeah,
you can see it now.
Yeah.
So there's that little bump. That little bump is a perfect place for your fingers to push against the teapot, and it gives you a really great tension so that it's easier to hold.
Nice.
That little bump takes a long time to implement, especially when you're considering how many that I'm making, because curving the clay that extremely when I've already shaped it into a handle is very delicate. It can crack at any part in that process when it's wet, and then it can crack again when it's dry. So like it compounds the complexity of the pot, but that little consideration, you know, makes it much more functional. It makes it easier to use. So each time I get faster at something, I add time somewhere else.
That's
an hour,
interesting.
I think, is pretty much the floor for me, because if I get faster, I also want to be more thorough.
That makes sense. That's pretty cool. Thanks for that explanation. Ruben K has got a good question. We've touched on it a little bit, but you can expand a little bit more. He said he wants you to explain how clay actually affects tea. Does it has to do with, you know, like heat retention, what is going on chemically that
So there are 3 main factors. I'm not going to talk about chemical interaction because I mean, like, there could be very, very, very small chemical interactions that are happening, but I don't have the palate to detect something like that. And I think that 90% of people do not. So the 3 main factors are surface, right? The texture of the clay itself.
Okay.
The density of the clay.
Okay.
And then the porosity of the clay. So like how densely packed the material is, how much air there is in the material, and then what the shape of the surface is. With iron-bearing glazes, you're talking about a microcrystalline surface. So if you look at a microscope, it's super sharp. It's like looking at saw teeth in a microscope. Really, really, really sharp. Super, super, you know, it's got a lot of surface area. Huge amount of surface area. And that amount of surface area that's interacting with the clay is going to change the way that the water cools, and it's going to change the way that the tea interacts with the surface, right? So that affects the tea in some way. The density of the clay is going to affect it because it affects how quickly it sheds heat. And the porosity is also a similar effect, right? So if it's really dense and really thin, then it's actually going to shed heat relatively quickly.
Yeah.
If it's very dense and thicker, then it's not going to do that so much.
Yeah.
If it's very thin and porous, it's still going to insulate better than something that's dense and porous,
right? Because
the air is going to prevent heat from leaving the pot. So those 3 factors are really the most important things. When you talk about something like silver, people say like, oh, silver has this refining effect on the tea. And I think that that's absolutely true, right?
Yeah.
You can do a side-by-side and taste the differences.
Yeah.
I think that there is some ionic interaction, but
Yeah.
the thing that I attribute most is that silver sheds heat so quickly.
Yeah, it
Right?
does.
It
really
conducts
does.
heat so well that it has this beautiful effect that when you put a hot liquid into silver, you're extracting all of the best properties of the tea. And then that water is cooling relatively quickly, preventing the extraction of any astringency or any tannic properties in the tea.
That makes sense.
Which gives you this really wonderful, bright, beautiful profile for the
Yeah.
tea. The opposite is true for a pot that insulates really, really well.
Yeah.
If you have a tea that has lots of imperfections and the tea and the pot insulates super well, then you're going to end up extracting a lot of those bad, tannic, bitter flavors. But a porous pot will also absorb tea oils more. So long term, that pot might give a lot more back to you. But initially, because it insulates so well, it might actually give you more, bitter flavors or whatever. But I
actually
think those are the
like
three main factors.
I personally find I like denser, thicker clays for pu'er. That's why one of the reasons why I like Jianshui a lot, because Jianshui is well, they generally always kind of like make them like super thick. I don't have a great example real close, but yeah, Jianshui, it's a super dense clay.
It's a very fine particle clay also.
Yeah, it's very it's not as it doesn't have as much structural elements in it like you find in a lot of the Yixing ones, which is also one of the reasons why like most Jianshui, in my understanding, most Jianshui can't have like those really fine details because it just doesn't structurally add up. So you'll find Jianshui teapots have like these thick, fat handles and like thick clay walls. And we did actually have some really nice, super thin Jianshui gaiwans made. And I don't have an example of one here, but I didn't find that they worked.
I have one of those.
I didn't find that for myself. I didn't find that they worked well for pu'er. But I had a lot of feedback from customers that were similar to that, and they actually thought that they worked really well for green teas because they didn't hold the heat very well. And so if there was a tea that was a lot more delicate, they found that those teapots or those gaiwans worked well for that. So that was my experience, and I like thicker clay. So that's the heat and the heat motion in the tea process is a really interesting way to. I hope that described. Hope that was a good answer for you, Ruben.
Yeah, and that's from a technical standpoint. That's what I can speak to most. When you talk to there are a lot of Chinese and Taiwanese scientists who study tea, and they study the effect of clay on tea, and they really are talking about like molecular interaction of the surface and how things work. I can't speak that technically about it. The thing that I can speak most to is about the heat retention properties of the clay and how that affects the way that you're brewing. That's the thing that I can really speak to, right? Yeah. So that's what I'll tell you about. I like dense clay that I can make thin, because that makes a pot that's very flexible that you can use for almost any tea. It's going to insulate relatively well, but not very, very well. Yeah. Right?
Cool. I like it.
Yeah.
Elio's got a question about how to, any idea of how to look for wild clay suited for teapots. They live in Norway, and from what I've been told, all the clay here is no good for higher temperatures. Maybe they're wrong.
So glacial clay is probably what you're talking about. Clay that was made from the erosive processes from glaciers, if we're talking about Norway. And that's going to be similar to the clay that I used in Taiwan, which was a silt, right? And this clay was the clay that they dredged out of the bottom of their reservoirs. And it basically was created by, the flowing of the water down into the mountains. And there's these huge deposits of silt. Really, really fine material, but it's super mineral rich. And what I would say about that is it doesn't make great clay bodies for a core, right? You don't want to use that as the main ingredient, but it makes a great additive.
Gotcha.
So in Taiwan, I was taking this clay and I was either mixing it with stone materials, feldspar, to make glazes, which were phenomenal. And I had some really, really wonderful, beautiful results, which that would probably work great, right? If you have a mineral rich clay, use it for glaze and use it for the coloring agent for the glaze. Or I was adding it to the studio stoneware, 70% stoneware, 30% this wild silt. And it just added a rich color to the clay. It does add the potential for bloating if you reduce it too heavily or you fire it too hot, but It'll add a really wonderful plasticity to the clay if it's a fine particle. It'll add a really beautiful color to the clay if you have the right amount of reduction. So I would say that a clay is never you can never dismiss a clay as useless. You just have to know what to use it for. Is it for melting? Is it for adding color? Is it for adding texture? Is it for workability? Maybe it just makes it easier to work with on the wheel, and that makes it worth it. It just depends on what you're using it for. Using a good core, though, that's harder to find. Lizella is really rare because it makes a good core for a clay body by itself. And then I can add other things to it to change the ways that it fires to suit what I need. But yeah, that's my advice. Wild clay is great, but it's best used for glazes or for additions.
Well, this goes back to like what you were saying in the beginning, is just understanding what it takes to actually like make that into teaware, how it actually, what the processes are to make usable teaware, and where it fits into the process and what you have to do. And that's where
Totally.
Experimentation and understanding kind of can play into it, which is pretty cool. So in that same vein, I find your approach to ceramics and pottery and teaware and clay a very rare find in the West, specifically even America. What would it take for more Western style or American style potters to kind of have this approach or mindset to construction or even clay origin in your experience or in your opinion?
So it's a complicated issue. In the US, there's sort of an identity crisis with clay as an art medium. Because I mean, like the experience I had in college, I ended up quitting college, basically getting kicked out of my major because I didn't want to make art. I wanted to make craft, and I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. But in the US, there's kind of this battle between the two, right? Yeah. You're either making art or you're making craft, and one is like highly valued and the other is sort of a little bit looked down upon. And it's like kind of the blue collar versus white collar thing, where like one is sort of highly regarded by society and the other is not as much. And we need to flip that script at least a little bit, because the idea that you only are making art once you've been doing it for 50 years or 40 years, you come from a long tradition of other artists and then it's art, that's a little bit problematic. We need to encourage young people to make craft and that be something that's worthwhile. And there are other young artists like me that are making teapots that I think are really wonderful.
Yeah, I've started to notice
Steele,
a little bit of a trend. Oh, yeah, give me the names of
Arturo Alvarez, Your Teapot on Instagram, and Jonathan Steele, I think is Steele Studios. Both of them are making really, really wonderful teaware, and they're two young guys, around my age that I think are doing great things. Jonathan Steele is following more of like the artistic model, making really beautiful vessels that don't really have like a specific cultural aesthetic origin. Yeah. And then Arturo Alvarez is following more of a Japanese inspired sort of tokonome path, really beautiful work from both of them. And I think the reason is just because, the tea community is coming up. And a conversation that I had with Alian, my Taiwanese artist friend, is that as America sort of builds its tea culture, so too will artists have to accommodate that. And so as there are tea masters, there need to be people that are making vessels and tools for those tea masters. But it's not going to look like Taiwanese teaware or Chinese teaware. It'll look like some mix of those things. And I think that, working with local materials is the first step toward making, American or US or culturally regional ceramics, because that gives you the basis for how you make it. If I'm working with Lizella, it informs how I make it. And then from there, I can use the processes that it lends to and make something unique. So I think local clay is the first step. Finding out what people enjoy using is the second step. And then, like exploring the culture and having fun.
Do you ever worry about claims of cultural appropriation? I know that's such a sensitive term these days. I mean, you and I are both, like white guys in America, like living in an Asian art form that has been going around for thousands of years. We take things that we like, and we find things that we like, and like take it and evolve it and move it around. But I certainly see, and there actually have been some people on social media that like thrown out claims towards us that like cultural appropriation. I was just curious how you would respond to that.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to acknowledge that if there's something that's referencing another culture, that you're doing it with respect.
Yeah.
So I know that you're coming from a place of respect for Yunnan tea, and that you really love the place and what they're doing there and the product that they're producing. So it's coming from a place of profound respect and love for that material. And for me, it's a similar thing, right? I'm making things, but I'm not claiming that they're anything they're not. I'm not going to say like, oh, my pots make tea better. I'm not going to say that, because one, I don't have 300 years or 500 years or 1,000 years of history to inform the fact that my teapots definitely make tea do a certain thing, right? And it's wonderful that those traditions exist, but I'm not a part of them. I'm going to say that I'm doing my best, and that I'm working with local materials, and I'm putting a lot of love and effort into them, and that I'm informed by the functional aspects and the aesthetic aspects of different cultures, but that I'm doing so because I love the work and I love what these other cultures have done. I'm not going to say that I'm making bunshangware, which is a Korean style, because I'm not.
Right.
I'm making things that I enjoy. I'm not going to say that I'm making kyusu, because that's a Japanese, well, right. It actually just means teapot, but I'm making side handle teapots. I don't call them kyusu usually. And I'll say that I make a sitting style pot.
Yeah.
Right. This is a sitting style pot. It looks somewhat like the Chinese sitting style, but it's not a sitting, right? Because I'm not an Yixing artist.
Right.
So it's a matter of, meeting people where you're at and being very clear about your respect for the origins of what you're working in.
Yeah, for me, I think it's the idea. I mean, even just the idea, and part of one of the definitions of culture is. Culture isn't a finite thing. Culture is something that changes. I mean, you
Sure.
see that in bacteriological cultures, and like it's taking influences and it's creating something new, and you see that throughout history, as like this group becomes passionate about something, and they want to make new things, and then this group over here is like, that's amazing, I really like that, and then they start modifying it and taking it and growing. There's almost a really interesting evolutionary aspect to just how culture and cultivation actually works, and that's how I go with it. I mean, we specifically work to represent artists in China. I'm not actually. I mean, there are some times when I'm making the tea, like my artistic contribution is just in blending things, but every single
Sure.
thing that we have was made and grown by potters, or made and grown by farmers in China, and teaware in China. And so if anything, for our perspective, we're trying to let people see what is currently being made in Yunnan. And yeah, I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna put my name on a tea, or my branding on a tea, and introduce some artistic aspect to it and things like
Sure.
that. But it's absolutely done with respect.
Yeah.
Shoot, man, we've been going almost 2 hours. We can let's just let's go till 4:30, and then so 10 more minutes. Answer any questions. You still good?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
I'm
All right.
very much enjoying myself.
Awesome. Yeah. So am I, dude. I could. Well, you and I have certainly spent many hours talking about tea and teaware in the past. So we could probably go. We could probably go forever. Let's see. Yeah, Ruben mentions he finds that Jianshui has a muddying flavor compared to Yixing that is stony, sometimes good or bad, depending on the pot and your experience. He says he'll listen to this forever. He's very fascinated with our conversation. So am I. And this is, like I said, these are conversations that Mark and I have had for years, many times. Every time he would come over for tea, we were always talking about these things. And so I'm really happy to be able to offer a little bit of an insight into a part of tea that I don't think a lot of people in the West certainly have a lot of deep insight into, the nuts and bolts of what it takes to make good teaware.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, if you're going to talk about clay in a tea setting, it's important to know that there are no generalizations that can be made about clay. Clay minerals are as diverse as the minerals of our earth, right? So when you're talking about clay, it's like saying, you know, any other thing like a plant.
Yeah.
And if you say like, oh, all plants need this amount of sunlight and this amount of water and this amount of whatever, like that's not true.
Yeah.
Every plant is different. The same thing is true for clay. So there are definitely converging factors. It's sort of like convergent evolution, right? Using different things to sort of arrive at the same conclusions. But you can't make any generalizations about clay. Iron-bearing clays can be very vitreous. Porcelain can be very porous, actually, right? Like that's not something you would ever think about because you don't want it to be.
Yeah.
But porcelains can be very porous, or you can make a clay called B-mix that's sort of like the medium between stoneware and porcelain. So it's very diverse. And you should never make, you know, blanket statements or global statements about clay in general. It's very, very diverse, very varied. And it's wonderful that in China, there are specific mineral clays that are identified and people have been studying them for, you know, generations. That's a really beautiful tradition for us to build on.
Just like tapping into nerd lore a little bit, like you and I were joking last night. You know, only the Sith deal in absolutes, and I've found that in the pu'er world. Like anybody who says like this is this, they don't know what they're talking about. I very rarely do that because every single time I do that, there's 10 people that come out and be like, yeah, by the way, like look at this, and I'm like, oh, okay, all right. So
yeah, if someone told my customers you should only use one tea for that teapot because it's clay.
Oh right, yeah, go ahead and talk about that.
That would upset me a little bit, honestly, because the reality is I work really hard to make sure that my clay is dense and vitreous for the most part. And I'll tell you if it's not. Sometimes when I fire it, it's going to be a little bit more porous, and I'll put that in the details. This clay is more porous than my average firing, but I'm trying to make a clay that's denser so you can use it for multiple teas. And the reality is like maybe you brew one type of tea in a teapot and you decide I'm going to dedicate it to a different tea. That's totally fine. I don't want people to be afraid to use my teapots under any circumstances.
So how would you how do you suggest people pair teapots with tea? What's your process?
It's pretty organic, honestly. I'll use a teapot for a couple different teas, and then when I find one that just sort of clicks with that pot, like this pot, the reason why I paired it with white tea isn't because it's the most perfect pot for white tea. It's honestly just because when I started brewing tea in it, I got on a big white tea kick. And then I continued to brew white tea in it for a very long time. And then I realized like, oh, okay, this is a white teapot. Whereas this pot, like it would make a great oolong pot. It has a really good spout for it. It's got the right size of spout. So it has a nice smooth pour. It's a little bit slower. So maybe not the best thing for young sheng, but it also worked great for sheng, you know, and that's what I'm brewing in it now. And that's what I've brewed in it a couple times. So I think it's just a matter of like what you like, and there's no reason why you shouldn't experiment and figure out what tea you want to use for it before you dedicate it to one. And
so don't stress it a little too much if you mix a tea or two into different pots and things like that.
Yeah, and the thing that I tell people is it's not gonna ruin the pot if you use all different teas, but it will give you more if you dedicate it to one tea. So if I only use this pot for white tea, it's going to give me better tea over time. But it's not going to hurt things if I, use white tea and sheng, or white tea and shou, or, if you do something really smoky like lapsang, it might interfere with a really delicate green tea, but that's logical.
Yeah. So Yodza Teapot and Tea's got another clay question here. With enough clay processing, like what they do in Yixing, could you turn any rock ore into clay from which you could make teapots similar to Yixing?
No. So it's really only sedimentary rocks, right, that have been compressed from clay into stone that can be turned into clay. Because clay mineral is actually something that's definable, right? It's this plate structure of the minerals that helps water to slide past it so that it functions in a way that you can fire it back into stone. If you take granite, for instance, which is just like, a metamorphic rock, I think it is. Anyway, granite is either formed from magma and then slowly cooled over time and then influenced by pressures. If you grind that up, you end up with something that would melt, right? It's
Gotcha.
more of a glazed material than a clay.
Gotcha.
If you work with raw kaolin, right, it can come in a stone form. like kaolinite, if you crush that up, it still doesn't make very good clay. You have to mix it with other things.
That's a good
So
answer.
different stones do different things. It's only sedimentary rocks like shale. Shale will almost always be able to be processed into usable clay.
Ben's got another question, and I can probably help answer it too. Beyond the level of one's own intentions and respect, is there any opportunity for Western tea merchants, enthusiasts, artists, etc., to give back and help Chinese farmers and purveyors of tea culture? So this is something that we think about a lot when we're there, and you know, there's an interesting balance between giving back and you know, colonialism. I mean, I guess you could say at some level, like, colonialists were giving back. Even just the idea that, like, we need to give back to those people assumes that those people are in a position that they need that. And in a lot of ways, I really don't know that the tea farmers and artists in China really need, like, the West to, like, give back to them, you know, or give them something, because it implies that they're doing something wrong. And so honestly, like, the best thing I do with the tea farmers is just pay them what they ask for the tea and then leave them alone. You know, I'll go there, and, you know, as much as I want to, like, you know, like, sit down, you know, like, live with them and, you know, like, spend time there, they will be going out of their way and changing their entire day and structure to help me out and do everything that they can to, you know, like, you know, be nice and, you know, like, making food and giving me place to sleep and stuff. And that honestly is really putting them out. They'll never actually say anything. And we've changed how we do this, because we used to spend a lot more time there, and, you know, it felt, at some point in time, it felt kind of selfish, honestly. You know, like, this is something that I wanted to do, and, you know, like, take pictures, and, you know, like, write a blog post about it, and kind of, you know, like, you know, treat it like it was a National Geographic thing, you know, and being very focused on this, and then realizing that, you know what, I don't like having my picture taken when I'm in Yunnan, you know, and trying to find that balance for us between, you know, like, showing our customers, you know, like, where tea comes from and not being, like, exploitative about it, was, you know, something that Lamo and I have, you know, talked about and considered a lot. So yeah, so that's my answer. That's my approach to it. Is I pay the farmers what they ask, and I try not to annoy them, and I let them live the way they live the way they want to live. Your thoughts on that, Mark? Probably as a closing question.
I mean, I think for me, it's really just a matter of, like, the same thing as talking about not feeling like I'm appropriating the work, is giving respect to, you know, the origins of the work. And for me, again, those traditions are really more Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese than Chinese, because Chinese teaware is a totally different process than what I'm using.
Sure.
Right? The tradition of gongfu tea developed well in China, but the aesthetic and the functional aspects that I'm using are mostly from other cultures. And I'm always exposing people to artists from those cultures, and, you know, giving the origins of my aesthetics and my styles and my processes to those places, and making sure that people are exposed to that work and those cultures. And that's really, I think, the best thing that I can do.
Cool. Well, pretty close to 2 hours. My nap window for the kids has expired. The kids are now up. If you guys wonder why I do these exactly at this point in time in the afternoon, it's because this is when my kids are sleeping, and they have woken up, and they will soon be getting very loud in this room. Let's see. Tell us about how people can find your teapots and teaware and stuff like that. I'm assuming you still have stuff for sale if people are interested.
I do. Yeah. So my Instagram handle is Sanguine Teapots, SANGUINE Teapots. My website is www.sanguineteapots.com. You can find me there or on Instagram. I respond very consistently and quickly to messages, and there's nothing too technical. If you want to ask me about anything for clay or teaware or whatever, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I like how we basically jumped, like, straight into, like, the deep technical details
Totally,
of clay, almost in, like, minute one. It's like, well, let's talk about mineral content and stuff like that, which I think is I think is great. So I appreciate, because that's certainly what I'm you know, curious about, and I know a lot of our customers are as well. Even if they weren't, I think the comments in chat were that people were appreciative of the discussion of craft at a higher level.
Sure.
So this was great, man. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. There were some comments. People are hoping that you can get your get a studio set up in Pennsylvania soon, so that we can start seeing some more new stuff. Because I'm certainly excited about that, and I think you do have some teaware available on your site, so if people are curious about that. And I did just check on the site, and this teapot is already gone. It's sold. So thank you to thank you to whoever bought that. That is the last of the original Crimson Touch brand of stuff, and I will get that packed up and out to your way as soon as possible. Let's see. Next week on Between Two Teapots, we've got Del Tamburini. Del Tamburini is the director of the Vancouver Tea Festival in Canada, and he does a lot with tea and alcohol and stuff like that. Some fun like tea alcohol pairings, and he also has a deep knowledge about what it takes to actually like do a festival, which is far more work than I would ever really want to take on. So Del will be fun. But Mark, dude, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate taking 2 hours out of your day to sit and talk and answer everybody's questions. So you guys make sure you follow him on Instagram and check out his website. And I do appreciate everybody tuning in.
For sure.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.